here's where we are on the brink.
A short time ago, the U.S. military carried out massive precision strikes on the three key nuclear facilities in the Iranian regime: Fordow, Natanz, and Esfahan. Everybody heard those names for years as they built this horribly destructive enterprise. Our objective was the destruction of Iran's nuclear enrichment capacity and a stop to the nuclear threat posed by the world's #1 state sponsor of terror. Tonight, I can report to the world that the strikes were a spectacular military success. Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated. Iran, the bully of the Middle East, must now make peace. If they do not, future attacks will be far greater and a lot easier.
That was Tito Benito talking about the massive success of taking out Iran's nuclear facilities across 3 different nuclear sites. Now, whether the mission was as successful as he claims is still an open question. You have tons of reporting across foreign and even domestic sources indicating that really nothing was done in terms of delaying the Iranian nuclear pursuit. Let's keep in mind that this whole sequence of events has only occurred because of Trump's ego getting in the way in his first term and eliminating the nuclear agreement that Barack Obama, along with a number of other countries, had negotiated and had set up. So taking all of that into account, and we'll come to some of this a little bit later, how did we actually get here? There's a lot of different ways that you can answer this question. If you zoom out, we are here basically because of over 100 years of meddling in Middle East affairs. And when you think about the US foreign policy, this has been part and parcel of the US foreign policy for almost its entire existence. But specific to the Middle East and Iran in particular, there was almost a direct handoff from British meddling in Iranian affairs to the US meddling in the Iranian affairs. When you look at the story of Iran, you have a nation that's sandwiched between 2 different imperial powers in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. You have Russia on one hand, who is seeking to gain influence within Iranian territory, and you have the British, who are also looking to gain influence within Iranian territory as well. All of that shifted with the Bolshevik Revolution. When that happened, Russia was in a state of chaos, and the British saw an opportunity to expand their influence within Iranian borders, specifically with the interest of expanding their oil interests through British petroleum. When you start looking at the domestic affairs of Iran, you have several shifts that happened over the course of several decades. For a period of time, as the British were setting up the infrastructure for British petroleum and the oil interests that they had within Iranian territory, there came a point in time where Iranians actually wanted to audit the revenues that were being generated from the oil industry. When the British refused to do a full and comprehensive audit, the Iranians threatened to nationalize the entire oil industry so that the Iranian people could benefit more from the revenues that were being generated. By the 1950s, British refusal to open up the books and take a look at what was happening with Iranian oil revenues led Iran to elect their own leader, Mohammad Mossadegh. And part of Mossadegh's platform or initiatives was to nationalize the British oil fields so that Iran could benefit and Iranian people could benefit from the oil industry. Now, this was something that the British refused to do and refused to deal with. So the British, in conjunction with the US and particularly the CIA, installed the Shah of Iran, who was more Western friendly and extremely repressive to the Iranian people. And you fast forward to the Islamic Revolution of Iran, you have decades of interference by the US and the British that came to a head. And the Islamic Revolution led to the Ayatollah taking power. And now Iran has gone from a pro-Western puppet government to an extremely anti-Western religious fundamentalist state. You can make the argument that all of this happening in the Middle East and in Iran would have never happened if, as many people have said, Western powers had just minded their own business and stayed out of the international affairs of other countries. But we know that historically, this has never been the case. You have centuries of British interference all across the global South, and then they passed the baton after World War II to the United States to handle that same sort of interference. Anywhere where you're looking at the global South, whether it's Africa, whether it's Asia, whether it's South America, American and British fingerprints in the toppling of governments and the creation of completely dystopian failed states that benefit the West because that makes it easier for Western corporate interests to basically steal as many of the resources as possible and turn the global South into an extraction source for resources that the West needs to live in the comfort that they've become accustomed to. When it comes to this pattern of behavior by the British and by the United States, this is pretty consistent. You can look through the history of the 1900s, you can look through the history of the 1800s and see the interference that has happened at the hands of both of these imperial powers and the damage that it's caused to the global South. When we ask the question, how did Iran become public enemy number one? The top reason that you have to point to is repeated interference and meddling by the United States. And you've seen that happen throughout the entire Middle East. Think about all the different countries that are propped up by US interests and Western interests. Every single one of those countries at one point or another had a leader in place that was at some level supporting US interests. And when the US decided that it was inconvenient to have these people in power, they went to another regional power and created issues. The Iran-Iraq war is a perfect example. You have to keep in mind that before the first Gulf War, Saddam Hussein and that regime that was in place in Iraq was a US ally. In fact, the war between Iraq and Iran was largely funded by the US through overt and covert means. And there's even evidence that indicates that the US funded both sides in the hopes that it would create permanent chaos to the benefit of the military industrial complex and defense contractors that the US relies on. When you think about the US's history, for a country that often talks about the beacon of freedom, this is a country that has in effect been waging war almost its entire existence. There is roughly a period of 12 years where the US hasn't been at war with some country or another and hasn't been meddling in some other foreign affairs. When we think about it, this pattern of dishonest communication is part of the American tradition. As much as the American tradition involves meddling in foreign affairs, the American tradition also involves a level of delusion where American leaders will continue to parrot propaganda that says that they are doing this in the interests of peace in the region. How many times have we heard throughout the years that we don't have an issue with the people of X country, we have an issue with the government of X country, and that's why we're bombing that particular nation, as if the bombs only impact the leadership of that country. The US has done such a great job of propagandizing to its people that these precision strikes hit the ears of the general American public as if it's some sort of video game, that these are completely targeted with no collateral damage, with no wreckage that happens to civilians, and none of that actually exists. You've seen evidence of this doublespeak even in this regime's leadership.
What we've said to the Iranians is we do not want war with Iran. We actually want peace. But we want peace in the context of them not having a nuclear weapons program. And that's exactly what the president accomplished last night. I really think there are two big questions for the Iranians here. Are they going to attack American troops, or are they going to continue with their nuclear weapons program? And if they leave American troops out of it and they decide to give up their nuclear weapons program once and for all, then I think the president has been very clear. We can have a good relationship with the Iranians. We can have a peaceful situation in that region of the world.
JD Vance gives a perfect example of American propaganda when it comes to how they communicate their unauthorized and unwarranted attacks on foreign nations. You heard what J.D. Vance said. We want peace with Iran. That's why we're bombing them. How ridiculous does that sound? And what we have to understand is that all of these actions are setting the stage for a repeat of what happened in the Second Gulf War. We've seen all of this before. Remember the language that came out of the post 9/11 era. Here's George W. Bush talking about his worldview in the post 9/11 aftermath and how he justified his illegal war that dragged us into a 20-year foreign adventure.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger. These are opening stages of what will be a broad and concerted campaign. I want Americans and all the world to know that coalition forces will make every effort to spare innocent civilians from harm. We come to Iraq with respect for its citizens, for their great civilization, and for the religious faiths they practice. We have no ambition in Iraq except to remove a threat and restore control of that country to its own people.
When we listen to all that, we need to listen to it with a critical ear. Here we are talking about the message of freedom and democracy, and all the while throughout our history, we've propped up every sort of dictator around the world who completely savages their people, but the resources keep coming to American corporate interests, and it feeds the capitalist engine that drives America. And the mythology of all of that is that we're driving freedom through the world and we're making our standard of living in the US even better. But what have we noticed for the better part of the last 50 years? The only people getting rich are the top 1%. And in fact, if you look at the most recent 10 years, the top 1% has increased their wealth by over $30 trillion. What's happened to the rest of us? Where have the bottom 90% been? And you've heard me talk about how the bottom 90% has experienced a $50 trillion transfer of wealth to the top 1%. Perpetual war enables for that to happen. Now, when we look at what's happened in the Middle East over the last 40 years, we have to be honest about what is driving that. Certainly, American military interests and energy interests are driving a lot of it, but there's also the fact that this plays right into the agenda that Benjamin Netanyahu has wanted to have happen for almost that same amount of time. In fact, here is a montage of Benjamin Netanyahu basically making the same argument since the 90s about Iran being an imminent nuclear threat.
The deadline for attaining this goal is getting extremely close. And Iran, by the way, is also outpacing Iraq in the development of ballistic missile systems that they hope will reach the eastern seaboard of the United States within 15 years. By next spring, at most, by next summer, at current enrichment rates, they will have finished the medium enrichment and move on to the final stage. From there, it's only a few months, possibly a few weeks, before they get enough enriched uranium for the first bomb. The foremost sponsor of global terrorism could be weeks away from having enough enriched uranium for an entire arsenal of nuclear weapons. That would place a militant Islamic terror regime weeks away from having the fissile material for an entire arsenal of nuclear bombs. If not stopped, Iran could produce a nuclear weapon in a very short time. It could be a year, it could be within a few months, less than a year.
So what you've heard is Benjamin Netanyahu singing the same song in the same verse for a period of almost 40 years. And he finally was able to have somebody dumb enough to fully act on his behalf. Now, you had Kamala Harris tell you exactly what was going to happen if Donald Trump got in power. Every dictator around the world would love to have Trump in power because he is too stupid to know that he's being manipulated. And what just happened? Trump did Netanyahu's bidding and brought us to the brink of World War III. As we're at the brink of World War III, which will most likely be a nuclear war, what do we see happening amongst the potato brain ranks of the Republican base. The red hat turnips are giggling and laughing and acting like they've actually accomplished something, thinking that this is a video game, having no concept of what an actual nuclear event would look like. In fact, they're so lazy, they haven't even heard some of the things that have come from their own party, from people within this administration about the dire risks that are faced by a nuclear war.
I recently visited Hiroshima in Japan and stood at the epicenter of a city that remains scarred by the unimaginable horror caused by a single nuclear bomb dropped in 1945, 80 years ago. It's hard for me to find the words to express what I saw, the stories that I heard, the haunting sadness that still remains. This is an experience that will stay with me forever. Yet this one bomb that caused so much destruction in Hiroshima was tiny compared to today's nuclear bombs. The bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima had a yield of just 15 kilotons of TNT, whereas today's nuclear warheads range in size from 100 kilotons to over 1 megaton. A single nuclear weapon today could kill millions in just minutes. Just one of these nuclear bombs would vaporize everything at its core. This is the reality of what's at stake, what we are facing now, because as we stand here today, closer to the brink of nuclear annihilation than ever before, local elite and warmongers are carelessly fomenting fear and tensions between nuclear powers. We must reject this path to nuclear war and work toward a world where no one has to live in fear of a nuclear holocaust.
They discount all of this as fake news. And that was Tulsi Gabbard, one of the Trump administration's intelligence officials who he deliberately discounted, saying that a nuclear war and her experience of being in Hiroshima and Nagasaki decades later brought into stark contrast the reality of what a nuclear war would mean and what it looks like to the people on the ground. We've been so desensitized that we forget the humanity of people all around the world. This is why the Republican Party constantly labels people as murderers, killers, rapists, terrorists, because it lulls you into a sense of imagining all of these people as inhumans. And that makes it easier for the US and US interests to commit genocide without the guilt of those actions sitting on the shoulders of all the gravy seals that are cheering for this sort of action. This is the height of stupidity paired with the height of ignorance. And that, in a nutshell, describes Americans in general, the Republican Party, and Trump supporters in particular. Now, as you see voices coming out to the forefront, debating what's going on within Republican circles, you have to ask yourself the question, does this signal a rift within the party? Take a look at this from Tucker Carlson.
Growing up in Sunday school, I was taught from the Bible, those who bless Israel will be blessed, and those who curse Israel will be cursed. And from my perspective, I want to be on the blessing side of things.
Of those who bless the government of Israel?
Those who bless Israel is what it says. It doesn't say the government of it, it says the nation of Israel. So that's in the Bible. As a Christian, I believe that.
Where is that?
I can find it to you. I don't have the scripture off the tip of my... You pull out the phone and use it.
It's in Genesis. So you're quoting a Bible phrase, you don't have context for it, and you don't know where in the Bible it is, but that's like your theology? I'm confused. What does that even mean?
Tucker.
I'm a Christian. I want to know what you're talking about.
Hey, where does my support for Israel come from? Number one, because biblically we're commanded to support Israel. But number two...
Hold on. Hold on. You're a senator, and now you're throwing out theology, and I am a Christian, and I am allowed to weigh in on this. We are commanded as Christians to support the government of Israel?
We are commanded to support Israel. And we're
What does that mean, Israel?
We're told those who bless Israel will be blessed.
But what? Hold on. Define Israel. This is important. Are you kidding? This is a majority Christian country.
Define Israel? Do you not know what Israel is? That would be the country you've asked 49 questions about.
So that's what Genesis, that's what God is talking about.
The nation of Israel, yes.
So is that the current borders, the current leadership? He's talking about the political entity called Israel?
He's talking about the nation of Israel. Yeah, nations exist, and he's discussing a nation. A nation was the people of Israel.
Is the nation
They're the
God's
descendants of
referring
Abraham.
to in Genesis, is that the same as the country run by Benjamin Netanyahu right now?
Yes.
That's Tucker Carlson and Ted Cruz having a debate on the merits of attacking Iran. And what's interesting about this conversation is that Tucker Carlson, when he wants to be, can be a pretty effective journalist. And you see how clueless Ted Cruz is and how he cites biblical precedent to justify bombing another country, and in particular, bombing another Muslim country. And Ted Cruz is a perfect example of what a uneducated, ill-informed MAGA political mouthpiece looks like. He is wrong on the historical context, and he's also wrong on the biblical context. Take a listen to this from Dan McClellan.
There are absolutely no data that support the notion there are any biblical end times on the way. Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion. And all of the data point to the conclusion that there is nothing in the Bible that is labeled a prophecy that has anything at all to do with anything that is going on today, much less anything that's going to happen in the future. The data point unilaterally to the conclusion that the things that are labeled prophecies in the Bible are things written by people in certain times and circumstances to certain groups with certain rhetorical goals that were focused on their own time period or the near future. These were things that people hoped or feared would happen in their own day or in the near future, or these were warnings that were being leveraged in order to try to influence behavior on the parts of their audiences in their own time or in the near future. The book of Ezekiel is about the 6th century BCE. The book of Daniel is about the 2nd century BCE. The book of Revelation is about the end of the 1st century CE. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are about the late 1st and early 2nd centuries CE. They're not about today. And the more people try to leverage the fear or hope or expectation of an imminent second coming or end times or apocalypse in order to try to structure power and values and boundaries in ways that serve their own interests, the more we do harm to our ability to thrive, the more we do harm to minoritized, marginalized, oppressed, and otherwise vulnerable groups, the more we do harm to the mental and emotional and the physical health of young people, the more we do harm to our own future, only because of our raging and belligerent dogmatism and refusal to think critically about these things. The only end times that could plausibly be in our future are unrelated to biblical prophecy and are directly related to the harm we're causing to our ecosystems and to our environments and to our social stability and to our ability to respond to environmental and to social and to geopolitical and other kinds of crises that we are causing by our own refusal to think critically about our dogmas. We need to grow the hell up and do better so that we don't bring about an apocalypse, because it will have nothing to do with the second coming of Jesus. It will have only to do with our own self-destruction. And I don't want to see that happen. And I hope nobody else wants to see that happen.
What you heard from Dan McClellan is a perfect illustration of how far off base most of the evangelical crowd is when it comes to their pining for the end times and these actions that they keep advocating for, which will lead to a nuclear catastrophe. These are people who sit in pulpits and listen to preachers who are telling them that anybody brown is evil and should not be trusted. That is the core ethos that strings the Republican Party and MAGA together. And Ted Cruz is a perfect example of a mouthpiece for that. And you've seen other people like Marjorie Taylor Greene echo sentiments similar to what Tucker Carlson says. But the reality of it is that what you're witnessing with these debates is not any sort of fundamental shift within the Republican Party or even a rift within the Republican Party. What you're seeing are two factions of the Republican Party that are wholly owned subsidiaries of two completely different foreign interests. The Tucker Carlsons and the Marjorie Taylor Greenes are wholly owned Russian assets, and the Ted Cruzes and other evangelicals are, in varying ways, assets of Benjamin Netanyahu. That is what we're seeing. This is not a principled debate. This is an argument about who gets to own all of the spoils of whatever conflict this regime decides to get into. When you dig into the motivations behind the evangelical crowd, let's call it what this is. For all of their finger pointing at Muslims, for all of their finger pointing at the Taliban and Al Qaeda and ISIS and ISIL and all of those, there's a certain element of all of that finger pointing that is accurate. But every accusation they hurl is also represented and well represented in the ideology that they want to bring together. Let's be clear about this. The Republican Party is a messianic death cult. I mean, we might as well call them vanilla ISIS or Al Qaeda. That is the Ted Cruz wing of the Republican Party. There's a line of evangelical thought that advocates for Jews to locate in Israel and as many Jews as possible to be located in Israel, and that a nuclear war needs to happen. And once we're at the brink of absolute destruction, the second coming of Jesus will come down and win the war against evil for the forces of good. And what that means is all the true Christians, the white Republican rich Christians, are going to be saved by their magic sky daddy, by Caucasian space Jesus, and all of the other lower classes, including the Jewish people, are going to be wiped out and damned to hell. That is the motivating drive of the Republican Party. You see these motivations come through in their efforts to implement and permanently implement every single element of Project 2025. And as I mentioned earlier, and as you heard from Dan McClellan, none of this holds water. So when we take inventory of where we are right now, we are where we are because a group of uneducated, toothless morons who probably have very few branches in their family trees blamed all the brown people for the problems of their own laziness and their own making, all the while ignoring that they were being manipulated by the billionaire class that has stolen from them for the last half century or more. That is why we are where we are. And in their hate of anything that comes with a brown face, a black face, or anyone that isn't a white Christian male, they found their avatar in Donald Trump, who was going to bring them divine retribution. That is why we are where we are. We are here because the stupidest people were able to mobilize and elect somebody to be the vessel for their retribution. When we look at all of this, what's really going on? Are we really looking at an imminent threat to the US, or is it something else? There's a lot of things that are going on, and none of what you hear is generally the real story. The message that's being put out is that Iran is an imminent nuclear threat. The evidence on that is decidedly thin. There's disagreement across all members of NATO and even within the intelligence community of this regime. So what's the real story? The real story is that you have a failing, flailing moron in charge of a regime who got embarrassed at his birthday parade because nobody showed up. It exposed him as a soft, weak, diapered, addled fool and demonstrated to the world stage that the emperor had no clothes. The squeaky tank is the perfect image for the leader of this regime. And the reason why these sequence of events occurred is when you have a malignant narcissist who gets embarrassed, he's got to prove to the world that he's a big, strong guy. We're dealing with a 7-year-old. And in fact, most of the people in this administration, old white men, are incompetent and inept to a degree that they should never be put in charge of anything. And yet, here we are. The fact of the matter is, you have a massive realization by a thin-skinned moron that he doesn't have support. And now, even his own base is complaining about the things that were promised that they haven't gotten yet.
What in the fuck am I going to do with a Trump phone? I don't need another phone bill. We didn't get a stimulus. We didn't get a Doge check. We didn't get no debt relief. No help for rent. No help for your mortgage. No help for groceries. They won't raise our wages. They won't lower prices. We're fucking drowning in debt, but guess what we get? We get a Donald Trump phone. A fucking phone. Gold plated with Trump's picture on the back of it. I voted for him. Do I want a fucking Trump phone? No, I want some goddamn relief. No food stamps, no help with child care, no clean water and Flint, no cheap utilities, but a gold-plated, freedom-fueled, white, red, and broke Android with unlimited patriotism for $47.45 a fucking month. Can't call your doctor, can't afford your medications, but don't worry, you can call your landlord and tell him you still can't pay the rent money with your Trump phone. This is what America's come to. No solutions, no support, just a $47.45 phone bill, phone plan. What is this? Is this a marketing plan? Are we saving the country, or is this all about marketing? They gave up on helping us, but hey, at least the phone comes with a flag so you can show your patriotism, I guess. I don't fucking know anymore.
You just heard a level of frustration by that Trump voter about what he isn't getting. In fact, all he's seen is grift after grift. And he's acting like he's surprised. But there's been a 10-year track record of this that we have pointed out. And yet these people were so blinded by their hate that they pull the lever over and over again. And it's finally getting to the point where this person is starting to wake up. But there's still a vast array of people that are asleep at the wheel thinking that this guy is going to defend their interests. That's going to change once the terrible bill that is working its way through the Senate gets passed. Because the people that are going to be hurt by the almost $1 trillion worth of cuts in all sorts of services are going to be his voter base. We all know that the vast majority of the Republican voter base is made up of uneducated white males. And we also know that the vast majority of the Republican voter base relies heavily on public assistance and government services. What's going to happen when trillions of dollars are cut from those services in order to pay for a several $1 trillion tax cut to the top 1%? What's going to happen to the poorest of the country that are going to be made even poorer so that the Jeff Bezoses of the world can buy another yacht? Maybe that will finally wake up the rest of the crowd. But even if they wake up, they did what they did and they're getting exactly what they voted for. What you're observing through all of this is just a reaction to being exposed as being a complete failure. This is a pattern of behavior. This is something that's happened throughout his entire career. Donald Trump is someone who has the reverse Midas touch. Everything that he touches turns to shit. And that's the bottom line of his professional history. And the fact of the matter is that what's interesting is that he is the king of projection. How often have we heard him point the finger at all sorts of different people about if you vote for this person, if this person's in charge, all sorts of things are going to go wrong. We even can think of a time when President Obama was in charge where Donald Trump was repeatedly saying that President Obama would go to war with Iran because he was not a good negotiator.
Our president will start a war with Iran because he has absolutely no ability to negotiate. He's weak and he's ineffective. So the only way he figures that he's going to get reelected, and as sure as you're sitting there, is to start a war with Iran.
Isn't it interesting that Taco Don made that accusation and we find ourselves in the situation that we're in right now? The guy that took over after Obama's term tore up the agreement because he didn't like the idea of a black man having his name on anything, swore he would get a better deal. And here we are 10 years later with no deal and on the brink of war because this guy is so weak that he can't get anything done. And now what's he doing? He's trying to pay off the Iranians to get them to make a deal and probably sign a deal that is very similar to the one that he tore up. That is how big of a failure this guy is. We have so much evidence of us being warned about the failure that a second Trump administration would lead to. If his first term wasn't enough evidence, certainly all of the political commenters and even Kamala Harris pointing out the disaster that was coming should have been enough to get people to move away from this absolute disaster.
Donald Trump intends to use the United States military against American citizens who simply disagree with him. People he calls, quote, the enemy from within. America, this is not a candidate for president who is thinking about how to make your life better. This is someone who is unstable, obsessed with revenge, consumed with grievance, and out for unchecked power. Donald Trump has spent a decade trying to keep the American people divided and afraid of each other. That is who he is.
And it's funny how the Trump campaign pointed the finger at Harris being the person that's going to get us into World War III.
A vote for Kamala Harris is a vote for Dick Cheney, and it's a vote for war, more war, likely World War III and nuclear war. A vote for Donald Trump is a vote for a man who wants to end wars, not start them.
How is all of that shaking out? In less than 6 months, we're looking at a disaster of epic proportions across the board in every segment of society. And that's before we talk about the terrible bill that's working its way through Congress. That's before we talk about the Supreme Court that is bought and paid for in the pockets of the billionaire interests, signing away their responsibility and saying that basically the executive branch can do whatever they want. Things are already at a stage where it's absolutely terrible. What you're looking at is an absolute disaster of a regime. This regime, in less than 6 months, has already demonstrated that it doesn't care about the American people. How many different states have been left hung out to dry with lack of aid to recover from the disasters? And that's before we get into the peak of the hurricane season that's coming. What do you think is going to be the impact of the shutting down of all of the weather observation services and early warning services that this regime has gone and done, all in the interest of making government more efficient? And what's interesting is that now that DOGE has less of an influence, their engineers are actually coming out and saying that they were surprised at how efficient government operated. Think about that. You have 40 years of Republicans, 40 to 50 years of Republicans cutting government to the bone, and government is still running very efficiently to the point that their hatchet people couldn't find nearly enough wrong to justify them being there in the first place. That's the pattern for Republicans. They will give tax cuts to the ultra wealthy, steal and strip everything and anything possible that benefits the bottom 90%. And when things go wrong, they'll blame government instead of blaming the billionaires and millionaire class that are complete parasites of society. What you're looking at here is a gangster government that doesn't care about its people. And it's even evidenced by their actions in Iran. They go ahead and bomb Iran and then tell the Americans that are there, who are there for whatever purposes, that they're on their own when it comes to getting out.
We do not anticipate offering direct U.S. government-assisted departure from Iran. Americans seeking departure should take advantage of existing means to leave. The Department of State has provided information and support to over 25,000 people seeking guidance regarding the situation in Israel, the West Bank, and Iran.
You just heard Tammy Bruce of the State Department saying that Americans are on their own when it comes to evacuating Iran. Who do you think the Ayatollah is going to go for and look for now that there is open hostility and they've sworn revenge against the American people thanks to small d energy from Taco Don? When you take all of this into account, you have a regime that's a failure on the domestic front, that's a failure on the international front, is being mocked by anybody and everybody. And meanwhile, they are still trying to push forward as fast as they can. They're disappearing people off the streets, and there's serious questions about what's happening to those people. They're setting up concentration camps in Florida. They're making transportation arrangements for these people that they're kidnapping and trafficking in cargo planes that are able to open their rear doors and are somehow not landing anywhere. Everything that this regime is doing is normalizing the type of atrocities that happened in World War II era Germany. And in fact, when you're talking about the transportation of illegal immigrants, these people are being zip tied and shackled in the back of cargo planes with no due process. and we have no idea where they're being sent. And this pattern of behavior is very similar to what happened in Argentina when a dictatorial regime took over. The first thing that regime did was round up the opposition along with the class of people that they wanted to round up and disappeared them by loading them onto the back of cargo planes and dumping them into the ocean. And isn't it interesting that we are now starting to see reports of bodies washing up on various shores with hands and feet that are bound and zip tied together and are washing up on resorts all over the world? I'm not saying that there's a connection there, but it certainly looks fishy enough to investigate. And would you really leave it? Would you really discount it, considering that one of the key officials within this regime, Stephen Miller, has said that his ideal vision of the US is one where there is a population of 100 million people and they all look like him. No, they don't look like Timu Gargamel. They're all white. So when the regime has people in power that are openly advocating for genocide, let's get in the habit of calling what we're seeing what it is. We are constructing concentration camps. We're in the midst of committing an ethnic cleansing, and it's only a matter of time before the rest of us are finding ourselves in the back of cargo planes and evaluating how well we can swim with our hands and legs tied. That is where we're headed. This is a gangster government that is rounding up people, disappearing them, all the while paying off their private billionaire and millionaire interests with government contracts. So realistically, you're looking at a whole slew of billionaires, millionaires, and their corporate interests that are getting filthy rich by looting the American people and committing ethnic cleansing and genocide. That is what's happening. What makes this even worse is that as bad as all of this is, we've seen this playbook before. This is the same exact playbook that George W. Bush used. And he used it to the effect of killing millions of brown people halfway around the world, while he and his military buddies got rich.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
Let's not forget that the playbook that's being executed right now is a playbook that was put into place in the post 9/11 era by George W. Bush and the Patriot Act. All of this flows back to that. This continues the trend of fleecing Americans so that billionaires, millionaires, defense contractors, and the military industrial complex can get rich. So as we look at all of these things happening, what should we be keeping our eyes open for? What you're inevitably going to see over the next several weeks is an escalation of the language of dehumanization. You're going to see the Trump version of you're either with us or against us. You're either with us or you're with the terrorists. You're going to see that coming through. And you've already seen the dehumanization efforts from that regime all the way from their first term in office over the last 10 years into the campaign and now. Every person that is brown is automatically assumed to be a rapist, a felon, a terrorist, or a murderer, or a criminal, or felon, or all of the above. It's only the brown people. And it's true. How many felons has he pardoned that have been white and have committed atrocities on the American people? You had 15 to 1,600 domestic terrorists belonging to the Proud Boys or Oath Keepers and various other white nationalist groups that were given blanket pardons. And now we're seeing them pop up in these ICE raids. Quite the coincidence, isn't it? The other thing that you're going to see more and more violence coming from the Trump regime's Gestapo. You're going to see an escalation of anti-Muslim rhetoric because we are yet again deciding to make the choice to go to war in a Middle Eastern country. You're going to see more abductions and you're going to see more consolidation of power. What we are watching is a slow speed crash into what 1930s Germany looked like. That is what we're seeing. There is no disputing it at this point. When you're loading up zip-tied migrants into the back of cargo planes and never landing anywhere and coming back empty, what does that signal? When you are constructing multi-million-dollar concentration camps in the Everglades that are effectively tents, and other red states are doing similar things to house these migrants. What are you seeing? What do you call that? Those are concentration camps. And yet you have these red state drooling morons that are cheering about this. One thing that I will say is that at least the German citizens showed some level of shame as their government exterminated their friends and neighbors. At least that regime did their mass exterminations in other countries, quote unquote, out of the line of sight of their people. In America, we're doing it fully in the open to the sound of thunderous applause. That is what these red state people are doing. They're cheering as these extermination camps are being put up. And that gives you a signal of the sickness that exists within the MAGA and Republican circles. There is no question about it. These are psychopaths and sociopaths that are trying to bring forward their end times by exterminating as many brown and black people as they can find. That is what this is about. So now that we know what is going on, what should we do about it? Frankly, when it comes to what we should do about it, there should be a lot more being done than what's being done right now. Yes, protests are good. Yes, we should continue those. We should continue those in terms of frequency and intensity. We should be much more active in obstructing these traffickers that are kidnapping people in broad daylight. When I talk about escalating this and bringing this, being more intense about this, we know the people who are pulling the strings behind this. You saw Tom Homan crying about how he can't see his wife anymore because of the level of threats. He's afraid for his life or something to that effect. That is the type of pressure that needs to happen, and it needs to be brought to the doorsteps of all of these Nazis that are actually pushing for this to happen. They should know zero peace, because the reality of it is brown and black people all around this country are not finding any peace. They're living in terror and fear of being kidnapped off the streets, whether they're citizens or not. So it's time to give these Nazis a taste of their own medicine. We need to be meeting them in the streets. We need to be meeting them in their neighborhoods. We need to be meeting them on their doorsteps and making sure that they understand that none of what they're doing is acceptable. They need to understand they have no room for movement. They will be given no quarter. And when it comes to how we respond, it's all options on the table. And it's got to be led by the people in our communities who have the most privilege. So white men and women, this is your mission to lead. You need to chase, corner, and confront every single one of these Nazis and Nazi sympathizers whenever the opportunity presents itself, and make sure that they know zero peace. They don't get to escape from the consequences of their action. That is where we're at right now. Now you know how we got here, and now you know the way forward.